Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Ryan, and I am with NWEA, and I will be your host today. Thank you so much for joining us for this live webinar, COVID-19 closures and learning loss. We know the issue is pressing and your time is valuable, so let's go ahead and begin. Today's event will be around 45 minutes with some time for Q&A. Everyone attending today's session is already in listen-only mode, so you don't have to worry about being on and off mute or interrupting today's session with a stray dog bark. If you have questions for our panelists, please submit them anytime in the Ask a Question box, which should be just below the slide viewer. Our moderators will be available to answer some questions throughout the event, and of course, our panel will field questions during our Q&A at the end. If you have any technical issues, our moderators may be able to assist you with those as well. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording following the event that is yours to use and share with colleagues or planning partners. There will also be a short survey when you close out of the webinar. We want to make sure these events are relevant and useful to your work, so please let us know how we did. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panel today. Dr. Beth Tarasawa oversees the research efforts at NWEA. The research teams are devoted to advancements in assessment and growth measurement, answering fundamental questions to inform policy and practice and drive educational innovation. Sal Khan is the founder and CEO of Khan Academy, a not-for-profit online learning tool serving more than 18 million learners a month. He also teaches at Khan Lab School, a nonprofit laboratory school in Mountain View, California, associated with Khan Academy. As superintendent of Clark County School District, Dr. Jesus Jara works to accelerate positive student outcomes, such as growth in the graduation rate, advanced placement participation, and the expansion of magnet programs. The large urban school district consists of 358 schools and more than 320,000 students. Kimberly Cockrell is a lifelong educator, serving in multiple leadership and executive level roles at Achievement Network over the last 9 years. She is passionate about developing the people and practices necessary to deliver transformational change and equity in schools. With that, I'll now hand it over to Beth to walk you through NWEA's recent research on the potential academic achievement impacts of the COVID-19 school closures. Beth?
Thanks, Erin. As the COVID pandemic closes schools across the nation, education systems are scrambling to meet the needs of schools, families, and 55 million students during these unprecedented times. School districts in particular are on the front lines to help ensure all students have access to academic materials, instruction, and digital resources, among other basic needs, such as getting meals to students facing food insecurity. The economic impacts and trauma of recent events will also have far-reaching effects that will likely exacerbate long-standing opportunity gaps. Extended time out of school will almost certainly affect student achievement, and that impact is hard to estimate given all of the aspects of COVID on schooling and society. At the same time, while it's difficult to speculate on what missing months of school may mean for achievement, research on seasonal learning and summer learning loss can offer some insights on the potential impacts of this extended pause in classroom instruction when students return to school. My colleague Megan Kufeld and I leveraged this research, as well as a national sample of over 5 million students in grades 3 through 8 who took MAP growth assessments in 2017 and 2018. We examined how the observed typical average growth trajectory by grade for students who completed a standard length school year, represented here as the solid line, compares to projections under two scenarios for the closures. The first we call a COVID-19 slowdown projection, represented by the dashed line, in which students maintain the same level of academic achievement they had when schools were closed, modeled for simplicity as March 15th. The second we call a COVID-19 slide, represented by the dotted line, in which students showed patterns of academic setbacks typical of summers throughout an extended closure. In other words, we walk the same slope we see in actual data during the summer months back to mid-March. So in reading, the forecast suggests students could return in fall with about 70% of the learning gains relative to a typical year. For math, these predictions are bleaker. Again, this graph includes real observed data represented by the solid line. You'll notice students who show an expected pattern of learning gains throughout the year, followed by declines in the summer months, also known as the summer slide. Here too, we project the COVID slowdown scenario represented by the dashed line and the COVID slide forecasts with the dotted line. However, for math, the percentage of learning gains made relative to a typical year would be closer to 50%, and in some grades, we'd expect students to perform almost a full grade behind. It's not just the more dramatic summer slide patterns for math, but the loss of critical instruction for the remaining months of the school year that makes these figures so painful. We give much caution here. These are projections, but like epidemiologists, we hope we can similarly flatten the curve, or in this case, reduce the slope of loss. So how might we do that? We offer a few considerations. First, consider how to make up lost instructional time. Second, create plans to close or narrow learning gaps. Third, surround kids with learning outside the classroom. And finally, we see these projections as a moral imperative. As we think through our road to recovery, we need to begin creating clear, strategic plans for restarting schools. Let's now turn to our panelists. Sal, Khan Academy has its roots in your own desires to offer math tutoring for members of your family. The research forecasts predict a dire challenge for many elementary students who progress through key foundational concepts of math, some of which are usually taught toward the end of the school year. Despite our best efforts with remote instruction, many students may advance a grade but miss key concepts. How would you advise school leaders tackle the challenge of providing instruction for math standards they may not have been covered?
Yeah, no, that's a super important question. The way I think about it, there's things to do in the near term, there's things to do potentially over the summer, and then there's how we address the issue as we go back to school. In the near term, we're trying to do what we can to make sure that school districts, teachers, students around the country and the world, frankly, are supported, that they can go on to Khan Academy, they can work on their appropriate grade level. We've just released things like learning plans where they could start depending on how confident the student feels or how confident the parent or the teacher feels about the student. They can start, they can also remediate on pre-grade level work and then work their way up to grade level. And what we're advocating is ideally the students not only try to do at least 20, 30 minutes a day during the closures over the remainder of the school year, but that they're able to continue that through the summer, which is in some ways an opportunity, which could be a habit that we form for future summers as well. But the reality is, as we go into back to school next year, you're going to have a huge variance. You always have a variance in the number and the ability level, the preparedness of kids in a classroom. And this summer, based on y'all's research, it's clear it's going to be, or this back to school is going to be even larger. And so what we recommend, we on our side, we obviously been working with NWEA. You take the MAP growth assessment, and ideally if you're using what's known as a MAP accelerator, which is our partnership with y'all, that will be able to place students into what is appropriate for them. And in normal situations, what we've been advocating as a reasonable implementation model is try to get at least 45 minutes a week, maybe one class period a week where kids are able to work at their own time and pace on something like MAP Accelerator. Teachers get dashboards so they can know where they can do more focused interventions. But I think for this back to school, I think it would be interesting to think about whether we double down a little bit so that students can get more time to fill in those gaps and get to grade level. So that doubling down might be starting school a little bit early, doing more focused blocks on things like math, more than one class period on math for some period of time. I think all of these are on the table.
Great, thank you. Kimberly, a focus on reading instruction, particularly for students in the early grades, will also be critical to mitigate ongoing learning gaps. How do you see school leaders, teachers, and parents supporting literacy efforts with school closures, especially for our younger ones?
Yeah,
well,
I think it's.
Sorry,
Sal. I think it's. I think that's questions for me, but I welcome your point of view as well. I think what we're thinking about here is one that weak foundational literacy skills can impact, first of all, students beyond the early learning years, and I think this is an area where it's critical to use a systematic and structured foundational skill program. I think it's important if we look at foundational skills, it is not going to be an area where students or even parents can, address that with just thinking about reading. I think exposing kids to reading is absolutely fundamental, but the foundational skills, this is a place where I think partnering with some organizations, or looking to what you've been using to really identify kind of a systemic approach. And my point there is simply that it might also require that as we think about the end of the school year, as it is now, when I say end of the school year, a few weeks back we might have been thinking of this as temporary. And now with announcements of schools closing for the year, I think we have to assess where students left off in their foundational skills program, and then think about where we'd want to begin applying that forward. There's discrete skills that need to be pulled out there.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. That's really helpful. Given the trauma associated with the current economic conditions, including joblessness, families experiencing homelessness, among other socioeconomic realities, these academic projections could disproportionately impact our most underserved communities. Next, we show the variation by school poverty level for math. The top line represents fifth graders who attend schools where 10% or fewer of students qualify for free or reduced price lunch, compared to the bottom line that represents students who attend schools where 90% or more of students qualify for free or reduced price lunch. We model the COVID slowdown and the COVID slide projections. Perhaps not surprisingly, you'll notice that much of the inequality gaps exist at the start of the school year. But what might be less intuitive is if we consider how COVID closures may impact kids differently across social class, racial, and ethnic lines. We know school systems, internet providers, and other entities are working diligently to offer free or discounted internet access and provide technology devices to help students bridge the digital divide. But even if all families have access, the impact of technology could still be uneven. And family home environments are even more unequal than technology. Finally, the shift to remote learning in the wake of COVID has brought additional challenges in meeting students' increasingly complex social and emotional learning needs. Thus, as Sal mentioned earlier, we'll likely see greater variation. So in other words, one of the major implications that our district partners keep discussing is how, come fall, one of the biggest challenges for teachers will be instructing students with vastly different learning needs, which is always difficult but likely exacerbated this fall. Moreover, our prediction is those students who lack learning opportunities at home or have already been performing relatively lower than their peers will bear the brunt of the learning losses. Dr. Jara, what advice do you have for teachers and leaders who must consider these potentially differential impacts, and how would you support teachers so they can meet the needs of all of their students?
Well, I'll tell you, I couldn't be more proud of my teachers here and some of the work. They jump right in. Obviously, as you talked a little bit about, you talked some, the first, the social emotional, the needs of our kids when we had the immediate closure that, as Kimberly talked about, we thought it was just going to be temporary. Moving on into where we are now, just jumped off last night on a conference call with my teachers, getting their advice. They're the experts, and then obviously this morning I had another one roundtable with my building principals who are already on this. As Sal mentioned, we have been strong partners with NWEA, offering map growth, and now we've been part of the pilot using Map Accelerator. So our concern is really how do we find ways to get into differentiating the support. When we looked at your data, my biggest concern on the COVID slide is that our most underserved students are going to be further behind. So it's how do we help our teachers, and what we're doing really is looking at when do we start offering map growth as soon as the kids come back in August. The governor last night announced that we're closing school for the remaining of the year, just like so many other states. So as Kimberly mentioned and Sal, using Map Accelerator now with our digital devices at home, into being able to at least provide some form of instruction. Our teachers are really looking at what some of the skills they're missing and try to, distance education through distance education, provide the opportunities now throughout the summer. But then looking at the map growth diagnostic when they come back immediately, so then we can accelerate the opportunity in catching up to students. The conversation we're having, and teachers suggested, by the way, this is where I just get so excited that our educators are on this, is that we either offer extended opportunities during the year or boot camp. So we're looking at some of these opportunities for us to be able to catch up our kids that normally fall behind what we call the summer slide, but now with the steep slide for our kids is identifying and catching up, once we look at our data, how do we accelerate the opportunity for them in the first marking period. So we're working diligently with our teachers so they can drive that conversation across the board in that first marking period across our school system.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jara. Sal, as we look towards a restart plan, what are some innovative ways we could surround kids with learning options outside the conventional classroom?
So once again, there's different phases we're going to be in. There's the phase we're in now, the summer, and then there's back to school and beyond. I think for now in the summer, what we've been trying to do, we've realized that a lot of parents and teachers are feeling, and students are feeling overwhelmed. They have the stresses of what's going on with the crisis itself. Then they're at home. Parents are trying to, if they're lucky enough to have their job still, they have their job and they're trying to not even homeschool, we call it quarantine school their kids. Teachers are having to deal with their stresses in life. And then on top of that, they're trying to figure out how to stem some of the issues that we're talking about. What we're saying and what we're realizing is, a lot of people are throwing a lot of ideas at them, but not giving them a lot of support. They're saying, here's 500 things on the internet that could be useful, and that's not that useful. That's just overwhelming. So what we've been trying to do is provide some structures for folks, make it simple. First, remind them that they shouldn't be beating up on themselves. This is a historic crisis. You got to take care of yourself first before you take care of others. And then start small. Whether you're a student, parent, teacher, if the students over this time period, at minimum, the math and the reading, which is the focus of your research and the focus of this conversation, that's where I think the emphasis should be. If the students at a minimum, and it could be different for different age groups, and we have those in some of our schedules that we put out, but at minimum are able to put in 30 minutes a day in reading, 30 minutes a day in math, and they can use Khan Academy. If they're one of the districts like Clark County that have had Math Accelerator, that's even better because it's already tied to the systems that the district has and the teacher dashboards and things like that. And then if they're able to do some time of writing, and it's just so that the skills don't atrophy. And so we've released those types of schedules, and then you could layer on from there to get some more of the science, the social sciences, et cetera, et cetera. What we are hoping is that this can continue through the summer. We've seen really good efficacy gains when students are able to use Khan Academy and or Math Accelerator even 45 minutes a week. There's a world now where they're not going to get the great stuff that typically happens in the classroom, but if they can even do 30 minutes a day, they're going to get a good amount of practice and those skills won't atrophy. And then as we go into the next school year, one of my hopes is that there's a silver lining and that all of the actors, we all know that there's a huge issue in device access now. But districts like Clark County have been doing heroic things. The telecom companies, the philanthropists have been doing really incredible work trying to get device access at home. And I'm hoping that as we go through the summer and back to school, school districts can start to assume that students have more access at home. And then they can, as you mentioned, surround the kids more so that 45 minutes a week of personalized practice is more likely to happen, or we can even try to raise the bar a little bit and get to an hour of personalized practice. And I think the other thing that districts are going to have to think about creatively are how do you double down as we get back to school so that reading and math, so that variance gets narrowed.
Great. Thanks so much, Sal. I take some comfort in your advice, knowing that the irony that we're doing this webinar right now and my two boys are on Khan Academy while I'm trying to work. So appreciate the comfort and the grace that you're giving parents in this time. Dr. Jara, for you, many school leaders in our audience, the machinery of operating a school district is not just about focusing on academics, but also providing critical services like getting meals and distributing technology to students who need them for instruction, among many other things. Clark County has made some tremendous progress on resuming food services and instructional programs for students. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're able to do to help students get instruction amidst the closures, and where are you focusing your efforts on now?
So, thank you for the question. I think, obviously when I talked about the food insecurity, 68% of our children are on free and reduced lunch. So that was our top priority, and really jumping in to make sure that our kids were feeding them as possible. And then putting learning opportunities, paper, pencil, because, with the challenges that we have within the community, Obviously, the digital divide was great here in Clark County. So we went to a lot of paper pencil and moving into a discussion around some of the curriculum opportunities that we have online for our students. So those were our immediate different ways to offer modality. We also have Vegas PBS, which is our public broadcasting station, put a lot of lessons driven by teachers, interactive lessons on Channel 10. And then obviously Cox Communication, our cable provider, came in and offered us, really proud of the community that offered us 4 hours a day for us to be able to do that as well. One of the things that we noticed, and back to what Sal mentioned, taking care of ourselves, taking care of the mental health challenges that us as adults and our kids imagine what we're going through. So we started just really with some of this, our what we call social emotional for the adults and for parents and for kids on TV, because it was really, we have to focus on that, on the most immediate safety and wellness before we can then get into instruction. And then now we're starting to continue to expand. And now that we know that we're going to really close out this year on a distance ed program, we started rolling out our Chromebook devices and opening up Wi-Fi with Cox Communication across the entire valley, so free Wi-Fi for our families as well. So then, now we're pretty much going door to door at home and doing what we call wellness checks. We're going to start that this week and providing Chromebooks and devices for our families who have been at home. But I want to also say that it's just really, the best case scenario is putting a kid on Khan Academy, on Map Accelerator, some of the other programs that are aligned to Map Growth, which is really, looking at, and our research team is looking at our winter data, helping our principals to try to make some sense of what we have, triangulating the data, to then pretty much helping our teachers then drive some of the instruction virtually for our students. Now we're looking at the summer and how does that continue? But it's the computer program is not replacing our classroom teacher. Our teachers are really spending some of that time with our students to try to make sure that that's something that we're driving, to really address the needs as much as possible. When I looked at the numbers, I was proud to see, and this is again why this partnership for me excites me. We had from last year, as we continue to monitor on a weekly basis, we had about 70% of our students that had devices that logged on to Khan Academy for Map Accelerator at least one time through the shutdown. So, 158,000 kids in our 3 through 8, about 70% of them have logged on. So at least that gives me some level of comfort that our students are in front of some instructional materials and instructional support that's really helping us and hopefully will help us when we come back.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jara. As we start thinking about recovery, it'd be great to hear from Kimberly. What are some of the professional learning recommendations during and after the disruption?
Yeah, so much that has been said just resonates with me completely. I think one of the things that I know we're trying to keep in mind is basically this idea, at least for me, I think we have a responsibility to amplify and elevate the voice of our partners. And Dr. Jara already said it, like being in conversation with those teachers and being in conversation with leaders is an essential part. We're all experiencing this, but I can't define the problem for you, and I can't solve the problem without you. And so the partnership is going to be so important. We've heard from, a teacher in Minnesota around this, that, she really had to completely relearn and e-learn how to teach in a matter of weeks with little support or professional learning at the time. I think, again, noting that when this situation, when this pandemic arose, we thought there would be a temporary loss, and now we're looking at longer term loss and an amplified learning loss. And so, we look at our partners across the country, and we're still thinking about With all of these solutions, how many of them don't have the digital learning? Sal talked about device access, and then thinking about what happens as they're sending home, learning packets to close out the year. I think we have to operate from a space of compassion and be comfortable not knowing all the answers. We're really trying to emphasize being alongside teachers, being alongside leaders, joining in classrooms to co-teach and to co-plan. Talked to one of our coaches in DC yesterday who, by being alongside in a virtual lesson, it was reflected upon that, it was almost like starting the year again, because we had to think about the things like, how do you give advice to or guide students in how to structure a classroom, how to respond, when to mute, all the things that we as adults go through. Kids are learning that as well, and so we have to be compassionate around that with our teachers. We also know that schools are dependent on to provide routines, and that we have to provide routines for the adults that both include space for them emotionally to process, and also create rhythms for them to get learning and training support. And we don't want to leave this moment up to chance. We want to provide, teachers with quality guidance on what to cover. And I think this means having a vision for how to close out the year, as well as looking to what this means about re-entry and an instructional plan for next year. So how are we utilizing the materials aligned to grade level expectations? How are we reviewing the most essential content and knowledge for each grade level and for the next grade level, and knowing that the stuff that we're focusing on right now is the most essential, and that we're minimizing the introduction of new material. It's overwhelming. I think Sal already said it. I think we've got a responsibility to provide resources, but also understand that those receiving resources are overwhelmed. And so we're working with our partners to start thinking about what is the strategic plan for next year. The impact of this is going to be felt academically and socially, not only now, but for years to come. We know that this isn't just a 3-month, this isn't just about the first 3 months of school. This is about the long game. And we've got to strengthen our assessment systems, our assessment strategy, to ensure that both we get a strong diagnostic at the beginning of the year, and also we have ways to assess for mastery throughout the year. And that in no way means flood students with tests. I think we have to think outside the box in terms of what we mean by assessment. And with that, I think it's crucial and important to engage our parents and our communities in understanding what they can manage and how they can be a partner in that. I know for us, ANet is starting to curate resources and put together back to school guidance for leaders so that we can be alongside them and help them in guiding, what's going to be a complicated road to navigate. And so we're also trying to do a little more targeted coaching and strategic planning for that support, because as much as I want to depend on what we need to from a digital standpoint, we're also going to need a personal support and thought partnership as we go forward in supporting leaders in supporting teachers.
Thanks, Kimberly. That's really powerful advice. Dr. Jara, finally, we'd like to end on you for the formal questions here before we move to the Q&A. But what advice would you have for a strategic restart plan for schools? What should we prioritize?
Well, first of all, I'm learning from my colleagues, and this is something as nobody's dealt with in the world and in the country especially. So what we're looking at, I can tell you what we're looking at right now is obviously, our kids are going to come back, our families are going to come back, our students, right, because of the concern on safety. But our main that's a priority for us right now. To the emotional point as well, to then the academic piece. Is how do we start addressing not only the standards that our students, this is part of where the conversation is, the standards that our kids missed, and that's where our principals are going on right now. And I said to them, we continue to say, look, We have an assessment that will get us to let us know where our kids are and what our kids miss, and that we need to then start addressing the needs of all our students. And I think right now, as Kimberly just mentioned, it's the support system for our educators and our parents and our students. One of the things that, as we're planning now for the summer, is what online learning opportunities for professional learning. So our teachers are ready day one. Our teachers continue to ask for more and more in support because they care so deeply around our students. So part of the things that we're looking at right now is how do we support our educators through this time as we have them at home, so for some professional learning, so they're ready to go day one whenever it is that we come back. And the last thing I'll tell you is just be flexible, because we're looking at potentially in August 13th, but then what happens in the fall? So we just have to find ways to be flexible for our families, for our students, and our educators, and that's our latest thinking right now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jara. I think we'll turn it back over to Erin for the Q&A section now.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth, and our panel. It was a great discussion. Before we begin the Q&A, I want to call your attention to a poll question that will be on your screen. We're hosting a virtual summit this summer, and we want to hear from you about which topics and issues are most relevant to your work. So please take the time to answer that question as it appears on your screen. We'll have details about the summit coming soon, so stay tuned and watch your email for that. We're going to go ahead and begin our Q&A. Our moderators have lined up a few questions. We've had so many really great questions coming in throughout the discussion. As we have over 3,000 participants online, we may not get to your particular question, but you will have the option to ask for additional information in the post-event survey that you'll see once you close out of the webinar. So let's go ahead and begin with, I'm using my own scroll. Here we go. Let's go ahead and start with question number, here we go, from Jean. This question is for Dr. Jara. How do you engage families who are not participating with distance learning?
One of the things that our schools are doing, making contact at home and finding out what the barrier is. And as obviously the ones that we haven't been able to get a hold of, one of the things that we're looking at, and this is part of where we're rolling out this week, is doing a wellness check to find out what the barriers may be individually. If we've tried to email, we've tried different things, phone calls. So now we're doing the wellness check and sending not only, we're sending some of our staff, our support staff, to go to their homes and check in on our families to see exactly what the barrier is for them not engaging with our educators.
Thank you. Our next question is for Sal. How do we change the narrative so that educators are not all approaching this with a deficit mindset?
Well, it's hard not to approach it with something of a deficit mindset, because we all realize that this is a suboptimal situation. So I don't want to in any way project that this is somehow, that this is not bad. With that said, the silver linings that I see are, everything we've talked about on this call, it's kind of an emergency situation right now because of the school closures. But it was always something that is useful for schools and districts and parents and teachers and students to think about. This notion of having a wide variance of kids in a classroom, all who need to learn at their own time and pace, this has always been a factor. It's just more obvious now. Access at home or inequity to access at home has always been a factor. It's just more obvious now. Learning loss from school closures has always been a factor because of the summer. You see that in the historic data that NWEA has shown. It's just more obvious now. And so the silver lining is I'm optimistic that a lot of people are leading with what is right now. You see superintendents like Dr. Jara, you see corporations, philanthropists, everyone's trying to do what's right. And I think people are coming up in record time. You know, it feels like forever but it's only been a few weeks that we've been in this situation. But we're seeing a lot of innovation happen really, really, really fast. And so if I'm a teacher, parent, student, administrator, the glass quarter full of this crisis is, hey, maybe we can build habits for the students to keep learning at home, that those habits can become patterns that we can leverage not just this summer, but future summers, that this crisis will make us think very seriously about the variance in learners' needs going into back to school, and it'll, to some degree, force us to address that issue, maybe doing, leveraging things like the MAP growth assessment, MAP accelerator, other interventions to make sure that we don't keep promoting kids with gaps. But the silver lining is those could be practices that we can practice next back to school as well, when hopefully we're through this whole crisis. So that's where I see the opportunity. If we can get more internet access to kids at home, that will be a leveling of the playing field. If everyone gets more comfortable with some of these tools, that'll be a good thing long term.
Excellent. Kimberly, this next question is for you. Can you recommend a systematic approach to literacy?
I mean, that's a great question. I think where I start with that is I don't have one systematic approach to literacy that I would name. I say that because I don't want to stand in the place of trying to have the answer fully there. I think like literacy is in 3 buckets, and that we should be considering that one is like the first we need to think about is comprehension. And so, and as I go through these buckets, I think in my mind, I'm organizing it of also knowing, do you have a literacy system already in place that addresses these things? And are you introducing something new because of now, or how do you work a program that was already meeting your needs? I just want to think about that. But we want to think about, in those 3 buckets, about comprehension, and then we also need to continue to give students access to complex texts. And I think more so when we think about world knowledge and vocabulary, now more than ever, we need a curriculum that builds knowledge of the world within and across grades. That's even more important. And it will prove to be a key driver of equity when students return to school, meaning, what is at the basis of that world knowledge and vocabulary. Our continued recommendation is for schools to adopt and support the implementation of aligned, high-quality curricula that continues to build words and builds knowledge of the world. But I emphasize the reason why I don't come out with why I personally don't put forth one system is because I think it has to apply to each context. Decisions need to be made, and recommendations need to be made in terms of that context. I think it's also important with writing to consider that we got to provide scaffolds for prioritized writing standards that were not fully addressed in the previous grade level by considering vertical progressions through the standards of the necessary skills that will spiral from grade level content when necessary. So there's a lot of components there to that response, and so I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Beth, this is a question for you. It says, I read research about gifted students and their loss during summer was significantly less than traditional regular students. Do you see the same pattern for this time period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we presented today were averages. And so what will be interesting, and I mean, this is somewhat of an unknown and crystal ball, is will the slide impact kids differently? We've looked not just at the summer seasonal patterns, but we're also looking into chronic absenteeism and inclement weather patterns to see how those have also, or how those might impact kids differentially across achievement levels. And we do see differences by percentiles. And so, I think the the reality, and there's people have different perspectives on kind of what to do about that or where to prioritize. But I completely agree with Sal that come fall or whenever we're back in session, some kids are going to be impacted differentially, and our most talented gifted kids, as well as those who have access to resources, likely won't have the same steepness of slope, right? That they at home may even benefit in some cases, and we may see kids really thrive with the one-on-one instruction that they get at home, and some teachers that have done really extraordinary and heroic efforts to do instruction despite remote learning. But I still think, and I think a lot of researchers predict that that's not the majority of kids, and that for most kids, it's going to be a real all hands on deck and a long game for recovery, and that those kids who come from our most historically marginalized populations may likely see the greatest declines. And so I think there's the short term, what are we doing for recovery? What's the restart plan look like? And then also thinking about what does it really take to progress and catch up. And like Sal mentioned before, these inequities have existed long before COVID. COVID just brings them into relief.
Sal, we have another question for you. Where is the balance when it comes to using online learning programs that may lack the social equation in the learning process?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important issue. You know, our view, there's a stereotype that online learning is in tension with human contact, et cetera. When it's done, and any tool can be used badly, but when it's used well, we actually hope that it can actually increase human interaction or increase the humanity in a classroom. You know, pre-COVID, I guess, you know, in the normal world, our suggested use case has been if teachers, let's say, are able to do one class period a day, that class period isn't just kids, you know, by themselves on their own computer and, you know, ignoring each other. In an ideal world, the teacher is looking at that dashboard, getting real-time information, is able to see which kids are progressing, which kids aren't, is able to do small group interventions with the kids who need to be unblocked. So that's a moment where, you know, technology is unblocking the ability for small group personalized interventions, which have more humanity to them. There's also opportunities for kids to tutor each other and help each other, which is, again, a way that technology can unlock humanity in the classroom. As we go into this COVID world where we have forced distancing, so to speak, you know, it is completely suboptimal. I think that's the biggest loss that we're all having here is the social interaction, especially for young kids. And you can imagine, especially for kids who don't have access at home. We're talking a lot about academics, but I don't know how any of us would have can maintain our sanity if we weren't able to at least get on video conferences for work or with friends and family right now. So I'm really worried about a large swath of the population. But in this COVID situation, I make a distinction between productive screen time or healthy screen time and non-productive. And also, it's more about what you're not doing in your life versus what you are doing. So if a student, and it's different for different age groups, but if a student, as long as in this COVID crisis, they're getting some time for play, they're getting a good amount of time for connecting with friends and family, either in person or on video conferencing, they're hopefully getting some time to run around outside and have some leisure. Then, if they're spending some time on screen time, if it's productive, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If there's good screen time, obviously you could work on stuff like Khan Academy. There's many other online tools. There's obviously, if you're now on a video conference, a Zoom or Google Meet with your teacher, that's screen time, but that's also an opportunity for socialization. If a student is writing a paper and spending a couple of hours on that's screen time, but that's creative screen time. If they're writing code, that's creative screen time. So for me, we've read a lot about, no one has a definitive answer, and whatever answers were there have all changed in this COVID world. We all have to be a little bit more forgiving of ourselves, and we are all having to lean more on screens now in this COVID world. But it's much more about making sure that you don't give up the things that kind of fill our bucket from a social emotional point of view, the connection with friends and family and the play and the leisure.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Jara. Kind of talking about some of that technology. This person says, most of these suggestions for support are technology-based. I have several students who are still not accessing resources online. These students also do not have parents that can support due to language barriers or work demands. So what are some alternative ideas to help prevent the widening gap with these students? Things like packets being sent home really lack some of the explicit instruction needed for understanding. So what are some alternatives?
So what actually that's part of the biggest challenge that we have, and I think Sal mentioned it, or Kimberly, we talked about we have moved in this COVID has forced us to move to innovate rather quickly in a matter of a week or 2 weeks to try to get as much learning as possible for our students. And that's one of the things that we need to go back, and part of what we're working on right now is what is a comprehensive approach to really provide this opportunity for all students. Right now, it's the challenge that we're facing, to be quite candid with you and the audience, and this is why this entire community, they're wrapping our arms around our kids and our families now, and we're preparing a comprehensive plan approach to be able to help and get the devices out, and then get the Wi-Fi, because you can give a kid a device but then not have no connectivity at home. So we're really working to be able to do that, and then provide a professional learning opportunity for our teachers, our parents, and our students. So it's just a whole comprehensive, because the learning packets are not enough because they don't have what the others. So for us right now is looking at preparing something that we're doing to work together this summer, and hoping that the federal dollars that are coming in from the stimulus money to be able to address some of these gaps. But this digital divide has existed with paper pencil, and now it's forcing everyone in the country to really pay attention to, because this has really put a magnifying glass in the inequities that we have seen in public education for years. So we're using putting the plan together, and then hopefully once the federal stimulus money comes in, be able to resource it.
Kimberly, this question is for you. Regarding the social emotional wellness and support of teachers, what specific resources have you found to be most helpful?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one is, quite frankly, I think this is also a call for others in the kind of like ed nonprofit space, which is to say, thinking about how, we aren't just talking in silos, but that we're discussing equity, access, trauma, and academics in the same conversations and not separate ones, which is to say, number one, while this is not always thinking about, quite frankly, adults in their social emotional response has not always been our sweet spot, if you will, but we've been thinking about who is best there, who sits in that space and thinks about what it is to think about how trauma affects students, how that plays out for adults. And so we've also been reaching out to other organizations and learning from their research there. And so I think, without saying, I think the first thing that it started, which was identifying, was just having the conversations with teachers, with leaders, where they were feeling overwhelmed, what they were saying about that, and then trying to be in one-on-one or even online and opening up virtual spaces to identify what obstacles or what feelings folks are having, and then being able, hopefully, to me, it's about identifying those who are best suited to address that, but also open up my own learning and our own organization's learning, which we've been doing for a while around what it means to, have a trauma impact. I've been thinking about it. We've also reached out to teachers. We had one example recently where we were talking to a teacher in New Orleans who had experienced Katrina, and just getting from them a comparison to like what it felt like to have a lot of resources and a lot of advice coming at you, but not having support And so I think sometimes it requires us, while as much as we want to go fast, it means slowing down as well, and for us to have those conversations. And again, for an organization like ANet, I think it's important that we identify and know other partners where that is their expertise and help match some of that expertise with some of the issues that are being raised in the conversations we're having.
Thank you. Dr. Jara, this next one is for you. This person writes, curriculum revision at our school is typically done at the end of each school year. Would it be advisable to do that or wait for a diagnostic in August or September?
Well, that's a great question. I think right now what I would do, which is we looked at to see what the stand is, but then what we are doing now, and I would recommend to look at where the diagnostic assessment, because I think if I hope it's one of our teachers or our schools, because that's the direction that we're going, is to look at where the students are. If you administer the map growth, I think that's the piece. That's why I'm a real this is not a commercial for NWEA, but it is if in some ways, because it really meets our children where they are. So then we can then know and really address the gaps individually per teacher, because not all students are all the same. And then it gives the teachers that the ability to set the goals for their own students. So that would be the recommendation, and that's what we're doing as a school system. And then we'll be sharing that information with our school leaders and our classroom teachers.
Thank you. Kimberly, we have one for you. How can we help prevent what might be a reaction of districts to narrow the curriculum to math and reading? So the person says, we saw this happen under No Child Left Behind, and it really took all the joy out of learning. Our students will be coming back bearing the effects of this collective trauma, and school should be a place of joy, deep learning, and cross-content learning, not just a series of, quote, drill and kill interventions designed to increase test scores rather than learning. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is where I can share my thoughts for sure, and I say this because I literally was thinking about this point this morning. I don't know what I would do personally, so I'm going to personalize this for a second. I don't know what I would do personally during this quarantine if I did not lean on like an appreciation for music and art and physical interaction. And I do think in every bit as we think about the vision for how to close out the year, and again, I can't stress this enough, I think there's a couple of things. These things are interrelated. One is I really appreciated Dr. Jara's point about how they're thinking about starting up next year in diagnostics. And there also is this point of, I think, how you end this year. Do you know where your students' learning, like where it was, where it should have been at this point? If we're lucky, all teachers have made it through, 3/4 of the year of learning. But that doesn't often happen. And I think, first of all, there's this thing about understanding where students were in all their learning. I think we should be stepping back to the spirit of the standards and understanding that, the joy of reading is in comprehension and literacy is cross, disciplinary. And we should be thinking about, when we think about the novels or when we think about the text and the ideas that we're putting in front of students, that it explores cross, disciplines. So, I mean, I don't think, that students are, I know for myself, that's why I said it's a personal thing for me, that I could not be, survive this without other ways. But I think we have to explicitly explore, novel and unique ways to engage students in what they're learning or know. And we've got to be able to vary, between virtual and analog modes. We've got to, for example, have students prepare and record verbal responses to text. This goes back to some literacy We've got to have them writing their own math problems, but that could incorporate other disciplines. I think we've got to stretch our imagination because I know for me, at least, the joy of learning went beyond. It was unlocked by math and reading, and that is fundamental, but it did go beyond that to other areas. And I also think we know through many examples when you think about what captures, when you think about differentiated ways in which students learn, what captures their learning is going to be diverse. Many students come to language and mathematics through music, for instance. I mean, there's just different ways to thinking about it. Again, some schools and some districts and some communities will engage in that in different ways. But to me, I mean, that's the thing there. The one thing I did want to go back to as well is I think, just thinking about how we're surveying and really, whether it's, as Dr. Jara said, getting out, literally going out to folks who we can't get online. And if we can get them online, how are we surveying what their needs are? And thinking about those questions being based in perhaps reading and math, but also going beyond that. And this simple things like this pandemic itself is a lesson in social studies and science. It's a lesson in how we, sociology. I think it will take a level of creativity to that, but I can't. I mean, obviously, I just identify with the idea that we don't want to take the joy out of learning in this moment, for sure.
Thank you. I think that's a great question to end on. That's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us and your great responses. Thanks to all of you for sharing your time with us today. A reminder that the full recording, as well as the slides, will be made available. And if you have a moment, please share your feedback on today's event. You'll see a survey once you close out the webinar. For all of us at NWEA, stay healthy and stay safe, and have a great day.